Welcome to the Social Fabric Unraveled. This is the explainer where we pull at the threads of everyday life to really understand the deeper structures of our society. Just a quick heads up right at the top, the audio you're hearing is entirely synthesized by AI. We use it to transform academic sources and lecture notes into a fun, conversational format. Okay, let's dive right into this. So, is the American family actually in decline? I mean, it's a highly debated question, right? You hear it everywhere, from political panels to your own holiday dinner table. Today, we're going to unpack the threads of everyday life to figure out the deeper societal structures that are really driving this debate. Here's our roadmap for today. First, defining the debate. Then we'll look at the case for decline, followed by the case for evolution. After that, we'll get into the deinstitutionalization of marriage, and finally wrap up with some modern demographic trends. All right, Section 1. Defining the family debate. You know, how you answer that core question of family decline depends entirely on how you actually define a family. In sociology, we have two clashing definitions. The structural-functionalist view sees the family as a very specific cooperative unit, usually a household with at least one adult and one dependent, focusing on rigid societal functions. But on the flip side, the constructionist view looks at the family as a socio-historical, evolving institution, basically something that naturally changes over time as society shifts. So keep both of these completely different definitions in mind as we explore the main academic debate. Moving on to Section 2, the case for decline. Now, what's really interesting here is the structural functionalist perspective, which is heavily championed by sociologist David Popenoe. In his highly influential 1993 article, American Family Decline, he makes the case that the decline of the family since 1960 has been extraordinarily steep. And not just steep, but entirely unique in recorded history. He didn't just see this as a shift. To him, this was a systemic breakdown. Just listen to this quote. He says, "Families have lost functions, social power, and authority over their members. Familism as a cultural value has diminished." It's a heavy statement. Popenoe truly believed the nuclear family is essentially being stripped down to its bare bones, losing its absolute core functions like child-rearing and providing affection. So, to sum up Popenoe's stance, he basically saw a massive disinvestment of time, money, and energy in the family unit. Instead, people are increasingly turning to investments in themselves. Now, it is absolutely crucial to note here that his baseline for comparison, his gold standard for what a family should look like, was the traditional nuclear family of the 1950s. Which brings us to Section 3, the case for evolution. But hey, academia is all about debate, right? So let's pivot and look at the opposing academic corner, the constructionist response. Sociologist Judith Stacey fired back with a piece provocatively titled, "Good Riddance to the Family." Her core argument, the family isn't ending at all. Actually, scratch that. It's more like it's diversifying away from a rigid monolithic structure. To Stacey, change absolutely does not equal failure. And this brilliantly illustrates the clash between these two perspectives. While Popenoe sees a decline from a 1950s ideal, Stacey completely dismantles that baseline. She argues that the 1950s nuclear family was actually a demographic and cultural anomaly. It was literally a brief blip in history that hid some deep inequalities, especially for women and minorities. So measuring modern families against that anomaly, she argues that's entirely flawed. All right, Section 4, deinstitutionalization of marriage. To kind of bridge these two clashing theories, we can turn to the framework of Andrew J. Cherlin, which provides some really essential historical context. Cherlin introduced this fascinating concept called the deinstitutionalization of marriage. Basically, he explains how marriage has fundamentally transformed from a rigid social necessity governed by incredibly strict rules into a highly individualized choice. Let's walk through this timeline together. Pre-20th century, marriage was institutional. It was all about economics and sheer survival. Then, by the mid-20th century, it shifted to companionate marriage. Playing traditional roles was still key, but emotional satisfaction actually started to matter. And today, we are firmly in the era of individualized marriage. People now evaluate marriage based on self-development, personal satisfaction, and way more flexible roles. And here is Cherlin's most fascinating point, in my opinion. Even though the practical, survival-based need for marriage has totally dropped, its symbolic prestige remains incredibly high. Marriage is no longer the foundation you build your adult life upon. Instead, it's become a capstone, a prestigious status symbol that you really only achieve after you built a career, save some money, and totally establish yourself. Looking ahead, Cherlin outlines 3 alternative futures for marriage. Number 1, a return to traditional roles, or reinstitutionalization. Number 2, a continuation of our current individualized state. Or number 3, the fading away of marriage altogether. This perfectly sets the stage for looking at what the actual real-world data tells us. Let's move to Section 5, Modern Demographic Trends. Let's connect all this academic theory directly to real-world statistics from Dr. Elise Neumann's recent sociological lectures. Ask yourself, have you ever felt the strain of the second shift? This economic reality happens when women work a full day in the paid labor market only to come home to a second shift of unpaid household labor and childcare. Since most households today literally need dual incomes just to survive, this second shift causes massive stress and fundamentally challenges the traditional family model. Okay, now let's debunk a massive myth. You always hear that 50% of marriages end in divorce, right? Well, the data shows divorce rates are actually slowing down over time. Meanwhile, marriage rates have seen a slight uptick recently, which is partly driven by the legalization of gay marriage back in 2015. We also have to look at major socio-historical stressors, like the COVID-19 pandemic. Surprisingly, the pandemic impacted generations completely differently. Older couples were actually seeking divorce more frequently during this time, while younger populations saw an increase in their marriage rates. Kind of wild how the same event causes totally opposite reactions, right? So, the crucial point emerges when we look at education and birth rates. The current U.S. reproduction rate is about 1.786 children per couple. To put that into perspective, that's below the replacement rate. The data clearly shows that higher educational attainment correlates with delayed childbearing. And women aren't delaying childbirth out of a lack of values or selfishness. They're doing it to secure their education and economic stability first, before bringing children into the world. Which brings us right back to our ultimate question. Looking at both the sociological theory and the hard demographic data, is the American family failing, or is it just finding a new, highly individualized form adapted to our modern world? I really want to leave you with that provocative thought to ponder. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer.